Hello and welcome to our mod tool tutorial video. I'm Dragon and today we're going to talk about tasks and fundings. Those are two important tools for you to create incentives for the player to make some things in the game that are less than optimal but also very fun. They provide some additional storytelling options and they can be a very good way to reward the player with additional resources and bonuses that are going to be very useful for the player in the long run. So let me start by clicking here the tasks editor. And if you haven't watched our previous video on events, I highly recommend that you watch it because tasks work very similarly to events. And so I am going to explain the tasks quickly by referencing everything that I have explained during the events video. So as you can see here, we have the task editor, and it is divided into two sections: our task categories and draw settings, and our tasks editor here to the right. And the basic settings of our tasks are the minimum interval between tasks. So basically the number of days that have to pass between new task is spawned for the player. And also there is the very important active tasks limit number that limits the random tasks. And what is important to know, tasks are divided into two basic types: random tasks and main tasks. Random tasks are limited by this number, but main tasks are unlimited and they will always be available for the player. So basically, main tasks are not counted in this limit. Underneath we have default draw settings for all our tasks, and it works exactly the same as in the events. So you can choose your priority, number of days between checking for new events and draw chance, and so on. And underneath we have task categories, and there is the basic predefined whenever possible tasks category, where you can add new tasks that will be spawned for the player whenever their conditions will be met. And also you can add your new custom categories for tasks. And let me do just that. I have created a new category for tasks, and now I'll edit it. Here you can choose your category name on the top, your icon, your advisor, your default or custom draw settings for your tasks, and create new task group. And inside this task group you can edit your basic task. So let me add a new task for my group, and let's say we are going to name this task repair economy. And similarly to events, if I enable this use default pattern ticker here, my title log key will be used in the description log key with _ND. And here you can set up our appear conditions for my task, a very important one. For example, for this particular task, I am going to decide that my economy has to be in shambles. So for example, my GDP growth condition has to be negative, so less than 0. When my GDP growth parameter is less than 0, this task will be able to be spawned. And underneath appear conditions, we have success and failure conditions, which are pretty important, as you can imagine, because they decide what has to happen in order for the player to win the task or lose the task. And so, in this particular case, we are going to set the success condition. And so in this particular case, I'm going to input this value here for my GDP growth condition. And if for my country my GDP growth condition is bigger than this value or equal to this value, I will succeed in my task. And for the failure, I do not need to set up actually anything, because I can simply enable this ticker here, can be lost parameter, and input the time limit for my event. For example, 90 days. And now, when this task is spawned, I have my GDP growth under 0, less than 0. And I have 90 days to increase it to this value here. If the player is not able to do that, the player will lose this task. Similarly to events, tasks can also be unique, but what is different from events, tasks can be resignable, because tasks do not pause the game, do not provide any options to be chosen from, they simply appear, and some tasks are, for example, too difficult for the player or too complex, or too unimportant that they can be disabled, cancelled basically, but only if you enable this ticker here. And also there is the main ticker for those tasks that are not counted in the active task limit. So those are the tasks that you need the player to have in their task list during the game. But this is just a random task for repairing our economy, so I'm not going to set it as a main task. Here underneath you have NGO settings. If this task is for particular NGO, you can set up some NGO event for this task and select the sticker here so that it will interact with our NGO settings that we're going to talk about in a later video. And of course you can set up the cooldown for your task. For example, I do not want this task to be available for a player more frequent than, let's say, 650 days. And similarly to events, you can add this the receiver of this task to target scope. But we do not need that. That task will be spawned only for the player. And what is very important, all tasks are available only for the player. AI does not receive tasks. And here underneath we have also availability settings with is triggered only ticker. And similarly to events, tasks can also be triggered by effects. But in this case, I want this task to be able to be spawned randomly. So I'm going to leave this ticker unchecked. And game mode availability, I recommend to leave it at every game mode. As for now, there is no support for multiplayer. And here we have the target group conditions. But this task affects only my country, so I do not need to set anything up here. But it works exactly the same as in events. And underneath target group conditions, we have reward options. And those are basically effects that are going to happen when the task is won. So, after meeting the success conditions, the player wins the task, and those effects take place. And similarly to events, you can set up only one effect for each effect holder here. You can set up some additional settings here for this effect. You can choose who is going to be the receiver of this effect, and you can simply set up particular effects that are going to be the reward. So for example, in this case, I want to reward the player with 1000 action points if he manages to increase their GDP growth in 90 days from less than 0 to more than the setup value in the condition, in the success condition. And also there is the penalty option, which is basically the failure effect. And if the player fails to do what I have mentioned before, the player will lose 500 action points. And that's basically it. You simply set up some appear conditions, success conditions, failure conditions, and effects that happen when the player wins the task or the player loses the task. And this is how tasks work. And as I have mentioned, tasks can be triggered. So you can create interesting interactions between your events and tasks, because, for example, one event can trigger a particular task, and here in the effects, you can set up an effect to trigger additional event. So you can create events and tasks chains that affect each other. The other way to incentivize the player to do more things during the game is to create fundings. And here is the simple funding editor. You basically click the Add New Funding button and input its name, for example, Olympic Games, and its description, of course. And its icon. And you simply input here the reward settings for your funding. So in this case, you can simply choose an icon and set effects that will affect the country that is going to win that funding. So for example, 1000 action points. And those effects are always created for the first place, so the country that is the first in the funding. And if you add new reward, it will be added for the second place, and so on and so forth. That way, each funding can give rewards to multiple countries that are going to be on the first, second, and so on and so forth places of this funding, in this case the Olympic Games funding. And to actually use fundings and spawn them for the player in the game, you need to use certain events for that. Let me go to the fundings event category that we were using in our pandemic scenario, and for example go to the food collection event group, and here in the food collection first event, as you can see, this is a unique event that creates target groups for the player and for the rest of the world. And here you can have set up funding starts effect, and this particular effect is important to start the target funding. And when that funding is started, you need to create some additional events that will be triggered and that will allow the player to contribute to that funding. And those events can happen multiple times during the whole funding. As you can see in that example, we have 4 options here for the funding contributions, and the funding effort increases by spending some money in the event. In this case, spending 1000 money increases the funding efforts by 3 points. And at the end of the funding, the country with the highest number of funding points is going to be the winner. So basically all fundings are event dependent, and I highly recommend importing our events from the pandemic scenario, for example, and taking a look at the structure of those events here to see how we can create new fundings. And of course, you can simply copy that event group and replace the names of your events and the contents of your descriptions and create your own events that way. It will be the fastest way because there are many options here, as you can see, and many events that are going to affect each individual funding. But at the end of the funding, the rewards are given based on those settings. And that's it. That's the video about tasks and fundings. Thank you for watching and see you next time.